Today's program is a change from our usual geographic focus, but with good reason. As you know, successive administrations, rightly or wrongly, have advocated a pivot to Asia. That means basically getting out of the Middle East. Anyway, that's what we're doing today, the pivot to Asia. Australia has been a steady and leading ally of the United States in the Indo-Pacific since World War II. And as global tensions rise between the United States and China, it's vital to understand the perspective from down under. Professor Blaxland's credentials are really extraordinary. They run for 7 pages on the website of the Australian National University. So I'll just give you a brief summary. He serves as the director of the North American Liaison Office of the ANU. He's also a professor of international security and intelligence studies at the Coral Bell School of Asia and Pacific Affairs at the ANU. Coral Bell was once my professor in graduate school, so I figure that's a pretty good credential in its own right. He is a graduate of the Royal Military College at the University of New South Wales. He's a graduate of ANU itself and the Royal Thai Army Command and Staff College. He rose to the rank of colonel in the Australian military, serving as military intelligence officer, as defense attaché in Thailand and Myanmar, and as an exchange officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency in the District of Columbia. He also has a PhD. Dr. Blaxland is a prolific author. He won the annual prize of the U.S. Association of Former Intelligence Officers for a book titled, and of course the title gives it away in a way, The Secret Cold War. His latest book is entitled Revealing Secrets, an unofficial history of Australian signals intelligence and the advent of cyber. We have a few copies at the back of the room, and we will sell them at cost. Dr. Blaxland will, I hope, be willing to sign them. But I only have 3 copies, so get them while they're there. I bought out Amazon's total stock, I'm afraid. I could go on for some time, but I think it's better to hear from Professor Blaxland. Sir, the floor is yours.
I'll just go back there a little bit. So I wanted to start with this map, and this is my, thank you very much for this warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll try, I'm sorry I don't have an interpreter with me, but I'm hoping I'm going to be okay just speaking lingua franca Australiana, all right? This is my favourite map. It's an Australian Air Force planning map centred on Darwin, but spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia, and also of the Indo-Pacific, which from an Australian point of view is a no-brainer, right? I've been a pontificating professor for a long time. My father enthused me in history. It's all his fault. He's since passed away, but he's read most of those books along the way. He was very, very happy to do so. And he was actually an Anglican clergyman, and it's lovely to see one here today. Jason, thank you. Along the way, I undertook what I called a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, looking at the internal strengths and weaknesses and the external opportunities and threats. And I showed these to my wife, and I thought, thinking I was pretty impressive. And she said, "So what, John?" And I said, "Oh, that's brutal," right? And of course she was right, because while that was an interesting exercise in and of itself, I didn't go far enough. And what I realised, I needed to go further. And of course, I'm a simple guy. I need pictures, right? And so this is the picture for me. It's this idea of great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, accelerated by the 4th Industrial Revolution. Or to put it another way, everything, everywhere, all at once, right? Or another way, the polycrisis. And how do we avert catastrophe with this polycrisis unfolding before our eyes? As we face a spectrum of global security challenges, the likes of which are doing our heads in. It's really significantly challenging for us. So as I thought about unpacking this, I thought I'd look at various aspects of what I'm doing here in the United States as an Australian professor. I'm actually with the Australian University, National University, here to foster greater research collaboration, student exchange, and greater awareness of the significance of the bilateral ties. There are 5 key things here. One is the ANZUS alliance, the alliance between Australia and the United States. 2 is the bilateral free trade agreement that's seen the United States be the largest foreign direct investor in Australia, and the United States being the largest destination for Australian foreign investment. 3rd is the trilateral AUKUS arrangement with Australia, UK and US for nuclear propulsion submarines and advanced technologies for the military. 4th is the quadrilateral arrangement with India and Japan, the US and Australia. And 5 is the Five Eyes. And of course I talk about that extensively in the book Revealing Secrets, pictured bottom right, and of course for sale, thanks very much Roy, tonight. But when we think about the commonalities, it's really interesting. You know, Australia and the United States are 2 of only 3 continent-spanning federal, bicameral, cosmopolitan, English-speaking, New World constitutional democracies. The only other one is Canada, right? It's extraordinary. We have so much in common, and yet we don't actually feature on each other's radar scopes as much as I suggest we should. The United States is unquestionably Australia's principal ally. As I say, you've got a trade surplus, largest foreign direct investor, but I would say American influence is waning, relatively speaking, in our neighbourhood. I contributed to this book on Australia's American alliance. I talk about ANZUS. ANZUS, the alliance with the United States, between Australia and the United States, is actually an 800-word essay that doesn't say very much. There's no commanding general, there's no headquarters, there's no forces assigned, there's no Article 5, mutual defence guarantee, right? It's a pretty wishy-washy 800-word essay. But what we've seen is in the intervening 70 plus years, a breadth of ties and connections between our 2 countries that make the ANZUS alliance itself, you know, relatively peripheral to all of the extensive ties that bind our 2 countries together. And Australia has unquestionably an interest in the US retaining a strong and enduring presence in our neck of the woods. We really want you guys to stay engaged. And we walked away from our own nuclear program in the 1950s. When you guys did a deal with the UK, we were helping them develop nuclear weapons. But part of the deal was that we would be informally part of the deal. And along the way, we also signed up to what some people call the suitable piece of real estate, the pièce de résistance, if you like, the Joint Defence Facility at Pine Gap. Anybody here ever been there? I'm very lucky. I've been there a few times. I used to be an escort officer for delegations to the Joint Defence Facility. It is jaw-droppingly impressive, right? And it is a joint facility. It is the only such facility in the world where it's 50-50 run by Australians and Americans, right? It's phenomenal. And talk more about that in a moment. Now, in this book I wrote with a colleague, the US-Thai Alliance and Asian International Relations, we did this in-depth study on how the only mainland Southeast Asian US treaty ally, Thailand, views the relationship and how they view China and other powers. That's 12 questions, 1,800 respondents graphed there in 2 simple lines. Bottom line is, the blue line being the US, the red line being China. America's influence hasn't gone away, but it's being eclipsed, right? And that is not something we're terribly thrilled about, to be honest, but it is what it is. But at the same time, we like to think that our voice about the region is worth listening to. And by the way, the neighbours in Southeast Asia and the Pacific all kind of like to hear what we are doing, before they make a call, or as they're making a call. They like to know what the Australian position is. It's convenient because we act a bit like a foil. We'll go quite often further than they would like to go in our pronouncements. That gives them some kind of buffer space to articulate a position that's probably more forthright than they would otherwise have been, were it not for the fact that we'd gone further than they tend to go. And it's worth reflecting, and as a historian I love to do this, reflecting on a bit of the history. And the Battle of Guadalcanal, it's not so well understood in Australia, in part because of the divide between General Douglas MacArthur, who after the fall of the Philippines retreated to Australia to command the Southwest Pacific area, which was mostly, until 1944, Australian soldiers. And Nimitz with the Marines, because Nimitz and MacArthur didn't get along, right? So they split up the Pacific. The Battle of Guadalcanal is actually at Honiara, which is Henderson Airfield. The reason, anyone know why that was such a significant battle? Yeah.
It does a lot of treating of the Japanese Imperial Navy Air Force.
It does, indeed. It does treat and secures the lines of communication. Bingo. That is because Japan knew that it couldn't attack and win. We had 5 divisions in Australia. We deployed several divisions elsewhere at that stage to the Middle East, but we had 5 still in Australia. And Japan didn't feel it could get there confidently and pull it off. So they decided to try and isolate us. And of course, where's the sea lines of communication between Australia and North America? They run through Solomon Islands, right? So by dominating there, they hoped to isolate Australia, cut us off, make us irrelevant and not suitable for MacArthur to use as a springboard for the return. Now, history doesn't repeat, but there is a certain rhyming going on, right? That's worth reflecting on. And of course, and we talk about this in the book Revealing Secrets, the Battle of Midway, one of the significant points in the war, where the Fleet Radio Unit in Pacific is working in collaboration with the Fleet Radio Unit in Melbourne, and they are picking up different bits of the puzzle. One bit of transmission has been picked up by HF receivers in Melbourne and Victoria. That is not, you can't pick it up because of the way the ionosphere bounces. You don't pick it up in the US, right? But the bits of the puzzle, when they're put together, gave them the answer to what the Japanese were going to do. The ambush at Midway, it enabled the US Navy to ambush the ambush, right? But what the movie, I love the movie, by the way, on Midway, and it's great, it talks about SIGINT and the significance of SIGINT, but it doesn't talk about Frumel, the Australian bit in Melbourne, which was actually a joint Australian-US unit. But the point is that it was about collaboration. We were working in an intimate, trusted collaboration arrangement that saw us do more than we could otherwise do had we not been working together. And that's, I think, a salient point. And of course, we see the architecture emerge in the Second World War, this industrial scale intelligence architecture that serves great purpose in the war. And of course, as the war ends, people think, well, now what, right? What are we going to do with this architecture? Some people initially think we'll just pack it up and go home. And of course, some people think, maybe that's not such a good idea. So we see in the Second World War an incredible intelligence architecture emerge in the Southwest Pacific area, with coast watchers and all sorts of naval, air, land and sea bits, Australian and US, working intimately together and working to MacArthur, and a whole swag of bodies that have an acronym here, but that are in fact these ones here: the Allied Intelligence Bureau, the Combined Operations Intelligence Centre, Allied Translator Interpreter Service, Allied Geographical Section, Central Bureau. What on earth is a Central Bureau? It's a euphemism, or it's designed deliberately to deflect attention from its real purpose, which is eavesdropping, signals intelligence, right? Same with Section 22. What on earth is Section 22? Well, it's radar monitoring. It's electronic intelligence, right? Except it was very hush-hush. And similarly with the Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. Well, they're not actually monitoring the phones. They're eavesdropping on naval communications, right? But that in effect is the architecture that sees a post-war architecture emerge in Australia that did not exist prior to the Second World War, right? And that architecture evolved over the years to establish what we call now in Australia the national intelligence community, which is intimately connected with its counterpart in the United States on a trusted basis. So there's, as I mentioned before, the suitable piece of real estate, the Joint Defence Facility at Pine Gap, smack dab in the middle of Australia, initially because back in the 60s when it was set up, there was no way a Soviet fishing vessel could get around there to monitor to listen in on the footprint. Over the years, it's expanded, of course, with the geostationary satellites that you can monitor almost the whole of the Eurasian landmass from Pine Gap. It is mind-blowing, right? It is incredibly potent what you can do. That facility is, as I say, the jewel in the crown, the pièce de résistance, the suitable piece of real estate. The superlatives are long and almost all of them true. I'm a fan. And of course, there's a whole range of satellite systems that are operating in this space that you can monitor from a facility like Pine Gap. And I can dwell on that. What happens though, so we had these organisations. In Australia, it was set up as after the war, we had Central Bureau. In the war, after the war, the Defence Signals Bureau. So this isn't AT&T, right? This is signals intelligence, but it's very secretive. And it's secretive until the Copernican revolution or the fourth industrial revolution kicks in. And that's where you see the SIGINT enterprise, which is where the hearth of computing power, where the Enigma machine, the bomb machines, the electromechanical computing power of the Second World War turns into the computing excellence of the Cray computers and more in the late 20th century that sets the path for the digital transformation. And SIGINTers at the time were thinking, OMG, the sky is falling, the targets are stopping using HF, analogue radio, what's going to be the future? And of course, what they didn't realise is it was going to transform the enterprise and that so much more was going to become available. But at the same time, there was this extra function emerged because the digital revolution is also the cyber revolution. The cyber world did not exist prior to the digital revolution. The ones and zeros that we could kind of see. I remember in the 1980s, a colleague of mine, an electrical engineer who I was working with, we were working at the SIGINT station, and he said, "John, a revolution is coming. It's ones and zeros." And I thought, "Oh, mate, you're on drugs, you know." And of course, he was absolutely right. It's transformed the world, ones and zeros. And it's seen, in Australia's case, the Australian Signals Directorate transform into this cyber security agency for the nation with a mission to reach out with a website and to engage society in a way that was unimaginable a generation before. Absolutely unimaginable. And along the way, what we've seen is the effects of the deep intergenerational trusted collaboration that happened in the SIGINT space. Going back to World War II, the deep trusted collaboration it continued after the war, intergenerationally, on a deep trusted top secret basis that only insiders were briefed in on until very recently. Even the idea of the Five Eyes was spoken only in very hushed terms, right? The idea that these countries would be trusting each other deeply and collaborating on highly sensitive matters was not known to most of us, right? But this is the background noise that makes the AUKUS arrangement possible. AUKUS, what is that? Australia, UK, US, a technical agreement to share nuclear propulsion technology with Australia. And that was Pillar 1, and Pillar 2 is to collaborate on advanced technologies to enhance our defence capabilities, collaboratively, building on the deep, trusted collaboration that goes back to 1942, which I talk about in my book, which Roy's very kindly arranged to have copies of. Now what, though? Now what? Now what? Well, as I wrote in this piece for The Guardian, literally the day after I wrote it the day after, it came out 2 days later. my sense is that the prospect of Australia's defence being dependent on the whim of Donald Trump points to the need to muscle up on our own. But the point is that the Australia-America relationship is bigger than one term, one person, one electoral cycle. Okay, the deep, trusted, shared interests and values are profound. Now, politicians tend to talk about shared values, and that's all well and good. That's their prerogative, but it's really about the enduring, overlapping interests that strike me. That's the real meat of the matter. And that's where Australia and the United States have been collaborating for a long time for very good reasons, and are, in my estimation, likely to be doing so for generations to come. And part of that's got to do with the shifting global power dynamics. This is the Lowy Institute's Great Power Index for the Pacific. Now, they didn't put France or Canada on, but I really felt that was an important addition to the power matrix of the Pacific, of the Indo-Pacific, which I needed to add. Now, when you look at China from the United States, there's not much in the way. Maybe a little bit of Japan and Korea, Russia on the side. When you look at it from down under, it looks really different, right? And a key point, I guess, I'd like to make is that all of those bits, they have agency too, but they don't feature on the DC radar scope, right? Because the headlights of China are kind of all-consuming, if I can mix my metaphors. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, in fact, they are really important. They're really important bits of the equation. They all have agency. They all have power across those dimensions of resources and influence. They have agency that we corporately need to take into account and not ignore. And of course, in the meantime, we've got the BRICS competing for influence. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a whole pile of wannabes as well in that space, who are, of course, have many overlapping interests, but also many diverging interests as well. So, exactly how effective it's going to be in the future, it's hard to tell, but it is a growing, it's growing in momentum. Now, we face today, I would contend, and I'll make this point in Revealing Secrets, we've gone, at the start of the 20th century, we had land power and sea power. And then by the end of the First World War, we had air power as well, right? And then by the end of the Second World War, we had kind of the inklings of space power with the V2 rocket that actually left the atmosphere before coming down on London, right? Well, a couple of generations later, we have the digital revolution, and we see the emergence of the fifth domain of cyber, okay? The cyber domain. But all the way along, we've had the human domain, or the cognitive domain. So it's not the hardware or the software, it's the wetware, the 6 inches between our ears, where I would contend some of the biggest battles are being fought. And going back to this idea of the great power competition, the fourth industrial revolution, I think what we're facing today is we are being outplayed because we are not thinking, we're using the wrong metaphors. World War II's as a metaphor has its utility, but its severe limitations. We, and as a former military officer myself, we gravitate to Clausewitz, Karl von Clausewitz, the dead Prussian, who wrote on war, drawing on the lessons from the Napoleonic War about how wars are fought. Right? Well and good to a point, except we forget Napoleon lost. He lost in Spain, he lost in Russia, and he lost at Waterloo. He lost because the rest of them caught up with him. So his mojo was lost, right? It's an important point, I think, because we've fixated on how good Napoleon was rather than how he was defeated. And he was defeated, in part, my estimation is, because he didn't appreciate the significance of intelligence. We also think in terms of chess, where you remove the player. You played a checkmate. And it's about reducing your opponent's capabilities to play, and usually by removing pieces. I would contend what we need to be thinking more about is the work of Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese strategist. Some people say it's a hybrid personality. It doesn't matter. The writings of Sun Tzu is what matters. And in that, the acme of skill is described as to defeat your enemy without fighting, right? And the metaphor which I think is most useful here is the game of Go, not chess. Now, can anybody tell me what is the essence of the game of Go? Yeah.
Surround the enemy, cut them off.
Bingo. And force them to capitulate, right? You force them to, you're not removing players, you're flipping them. You're forcing them onto your side. Sound familiar? Right. So this is, I think, what's happening, but it's happening with the fourth industrial revolution in the mix. So it's now not just in the old sense of way things are done, it's now happening in a digital space as well. That is doing our heads in. And there was a book by a couple of Chinese colonels in the late 1990s called Unrestricted Warfare, which came out at the time talking about psychological, media, legal and economic warfare, and it just seemed over the top. OTT, right? Completely over the top. Because no one seriously believed that that was what was going on. And in part, I think it's because we have this old school idea of war and peace, this binary. We're not at war with China, therefore we must be at peace. Well, I don't think that's how it is. I think what it is actually better, if you take the word warfare out and put in the word competition, then all of a sudden, click, 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 click. All these bits fall into place. What's been going on for the last couple of decades is actually, it makes more sense, right? We're facing unrestricted competition, right? Now, not all competition is bad. We like competition. We play sport, right? You think about the Sputnik, Soviets launched Sputnik 57. It spurs on the United States to 12 years later, put a man on the moon. That's amazing, right? That's competition at work. So it's not all bad, right? But it can be if you're not paying attention. And all of these dimensions of it are happening psychologically, media-wise, legally, and economically. We're being played, and we barely recognise the ground rules because we're using the wrong metaphors. Part of it is because I think we're facing a competition prism where we think of conflict or peace rather than a mixture of everything else in between, right? Of cooperation, contestation, collaboration, compromise, confrontation when necessary, and hopefully the avoidance of actual outright conflict, kinetic conflict. And I think here some examples from the Second World War, from the 20th century, are useful for us to think about. The Korean War saw Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandpa, attack the South after Dean Acheson had gone to the National Press Club in Washington in January 1950, said American interests extend to the border of Japan, by implication, not Taiwan, not Korea. So Kim Il-sung reads that as a green light. I can invade, no one's going to pay any attention. But he did it so ferociously, it generated a global, visceral response that saw the UN command established. China does not want to see that repeated over Taiwan. They will do everything they can to avoid that kind of repeat. So I'm pretty confident we're not going to see a Korean War-like attack on Taiwan. And as my ambassador, former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's talked about in his book The Avoidable War, I think there's scope for managed strategic competition. And in his new book on Xi Jinping, on a likely the course of CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's policy under Xi, there's a number of dimensions that he addresses which are, I think, really useful to think about. They are all requiring steely-eyed resolve to address, okay? But with a clear understanding of what is actually at stake and what is actually going on, and how to respond without making things worse, without playing into their hand. And I'll leave them there for a minute for you to think about. and I'm happy to take questions. I'm mindful of we don't want to dwell on this too long, so we'll just happy to take questions later. But when we think about America's engagement in the Pacific, there's a lot of countries in this space, but America, when it looks at the Pacific, it doesn't see very much. There are a couple of dots, right? A blot of ink at the most, right? Hawaii's the biggest one, obviously, but, people barely think about the Aleutians, let alone these little territories. What on earth is that? Well, of not much consequence, surely, right? Well, actually, maybe it is, right? When you add their exclusive economic zones, OMG, all of a sudden, half of the Pacific is an American lake. And guess what? China doesn't like that and is trying to undermine you. But you need to realise it's actually happening to do anything about it. And similarly in Australia, we need a bit of a wake-up call as well. And guess what's just happened in the Solomon Islands? There's been a security pact signed between China and the Solomon Islands. Oh, hang on a minute. Isn't that where there was a big battle in 1942? I wonder why that's of interest to them. Well, it's not about the airfields anymore, but there's undersea cables, the political influence of the votes at the UN, in the General Assembly, etc. Incredibly consequential. This is the areas where Kiribati is being bought off as well, okay? This is on for young and old. The exclusive economic zones of America's and territories and of the states of compacts of the Free Association are consequential, deeply consequential. And China is very interested in taking. They signed up to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea with a very small exclusive economic zone. They want the fish protein, they want the seabed resources, they want the political influence, they want the economic influence. You can't blame them. I mean, it's perfectly rational and understandable. It's just not in your interests and not in my interests, right? We just need to be aware of it. In the meantime, we've got what I'm calling is the reverse opium war going on. Fentanyl, precursor materials coming out of southern China and around Myanmar and the Golden Triangle, imported into Mexico, into the Pacific and into Australia on an industrial scale. And we're barely getting our heads around it. And we're not seeing it as part of this unrestricted competition. Meanwhile, we've got the sea lines of communication. When you look at the map, this is a map from a defence document a number of years ago. It gives you the hot spots, right? That's what they call the Malacca dilemma for China, right? China and all these Northeast Asian states depend overwhelmingly on free access to the Malacca Strait to get oil and other resources through there, right? This is the jugular vein of the Indo-Pacific. This is a crucial artery. And it's why, in my estimation, the BRICS, the BRI has been emphasised, because it's about mitigating the risks and obviating the need to be so reliant on this one single point of failure, single point of vulnerability, which goes a long way to explain why that is so important to them. Particularly should they want to take Taiwan, or particularly should they want to avoid being blackmailed or cajoled. Now, if you look at that space where that operates, this area here, this is Southeast Asia, or where the association of Southeast Asian nations it resides, right? And it concerns me that the US doesn't see how significant ASEAN, or this space, is to its own interests, to global affairs. It's the gate, okay? It's the gate between the Indo and the Pacific. But it's what I call a proto-great power, and it's only a proto-great power because of the many differences. Unlike Europe, where it's essentially a post-Christian, Latin-derived scripts and Judeo-Christian influence, this is very diverse. There's no one script, no one language, except they all speak English for official purposes. But the diversity is extraordinary, and it's manifesting terribly, awfully at the moment in the civil war in Myanmar, pictured on the right there. Shocking, and the world's turning a blind eye to this. We're worried more about other parts of the world where it's easy to, complain or protest about without having to do very much. And even neighbours, Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, very happy to criticise America over its Middle East policy and do sweet Fanny Annie about Myanmar, right? So for us in Australia, we look on at that, at Southeast Asia. We're trying to reconcile our history with our geography. So we're essentially Anglo-European transplants sitting on the edge of Asia, right? That's what we are, essentially. Increasingly cosmopolitan. About half of the population has a parent born abroad. About a quarter of them have a connection with Asia. East, southeast, south, or southwest. But few of us Anglos actually speak anything. You know, we're barely monolingual, as I like to say. You know? We barely speak English, right? I mean, you're struggling. You're right. I can appreciate it, right? But also, I would contend we're a middle power with small power pretensions. We don't want to be in charge. We don't want to lead. We'd rather you guys do it, right? But sometimes you guys get distracted, and we think, oh, well, who's going to lead? Well, maybe we should. Well, no, I don't want about. You know, it's a problem. We've also got a fear of abandonment, and we've got contrasted with this fear of entrapment. So we have this dialectic going on here. We want to be allies with the United States, and there's a part of us that's afraid that you're going to suck us into another major war, right? Which is an understandable concern. And so there's this debate, and I say mindful, of course, that ANZUS is an 800-word essay that doesn't say very much. So there's interesting contrasting impulses in Australia's body politic. Understandable, it's a democracy. These things happen. I'm placing it. At the same time, we have this dialectic of being an independent ally and a dependent ally. And these two scholars, Coral Bell on being a dependent ally, and Shannon Tao, who graduate from the Coral Bell School, actually, on Australia being independent. So I actually think the bottom line is the perception of Australia being dependent is a certain truth to it. We rely on American technology. We work collaboratively with the United States because we want the benefit of the security umbrella. We like the rules-based international order that the United States has facilitated. You know, it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire. Not holy, not really Roman, and barely an empire, right? But it still was, right? And so that's like the rules-based order. It's kind of, well, whose rules and how many exceptions to the rules are there? How long have I got, Roy?
About 5 more minutes.
Okay, right. And then we've got this dialectic of defence of Australia versus forward defence. So world wars, we go forward. Korea, we go forward. Vietnam, we go forward. Afghanistan, Iraq, we go forward. In between, we come home and think, well, we'll just look after ourselves. But we've had a flipping. We're now realising we need to engage in Indonesia and the Pacific because of this strategic competition. We're seeing that as more important than ever. So we lead when we need to, and I was the Brigade Intelligence Officer for the Australian intervention in East Timor in 1999, and we'll follow when we need to in Korea, in Afghanistan or Iraq, or in Vietnam. Of course, there's problems with that because like in the US, we're a democracy. If you overdo it, if you don't bring the people with you, you get blowback, right? You get blowback, as we did, like you did, in the Vietnam War era. But we went through a demographic transition. When you were going through Martin Luther King having a dream, we were getting rid of the white Australia policy. So we've gone from being white Australian to being much more multicultural. Lots of parallels between our two countries. And of course, the war in Ukraine raises a lot of questions, and I'm happy to talk about that. Mindful we're running out of time. The war in the Middle East is similarly generating lots of concern about how we operate together, what can we do, what should we do, and what are the ramifications. For Australia, we've been concerned about foreign policy, and look, when Trump came into office the first time, we wrote this foreign policy white paper. I call it Australia's foreign policy plan B. What happens when Donald Trump wins office and what you know isn't the case anymore? And we basically sought to double down on all the relations we could, not at all retreating from our relationship with the US, but looking to hedge our bets by building ties with anyone else who talked to us. Japan, Southeast Asia, NATO, you name it. We talked to everybody to try and boost connections. But the slocks, the straits, the choke points, the real estate, if you like, around Australia remain of incredible consequence in the great game, okay, if you like. There's the sea lines of communication through the gateway, if you like, between the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the recently announced submarine base for the new nuclear submarines. They're going to be based in Australia. It's Fremantle, where at the height of the Second World War, 170 Allied submarines operated interdicting Japanese imperial maritime traffic and crippling the war effort for Japan. That is not lost on China, okay? So I've been a defendant of our purchase of US nuclear submarines and us building a nuclear propulsion technology capability. In part, most people don't understand, in my view, diesel electrics don't work for Australia anymore when you've got to travel the kind of distances that are involved to get from Perth to any other spot in the world, let alone around Australia. You have to snort, that is, you have to put your snorkel up to recharge your batteries at least a dozen times. And each one of those times is now a point of significant vulnerability. Why? Because of almost saturation low Earth polar orbit satellites from China, coupled with drones, coupled with pattern analysis. They've got 30 years of submarine pattern analysis, and AI. You come up, you can detect the wake of the snorkel. If you're detected, the only advantage of a submarine is stealth. So if you lose stealth, back up and go home, right? That's why for us now, the nuclear propulsion is really critical. And there's lots of critics about saying we should get air-independent propulsion or sea transparency is coming. I don't buy this. Drones also is problematic because of the attenuation of signals underwater. You can't operate them at distance. And there's an argument that they cost too much. Well, everything over 30 years is going to cost a lot, right? If you amortise things inappropriately. And of course, the other dimension of this whole domain we're talking about, the four domains of the Venn diagram, is the fourth industrial revolution and cyberspace, which is not just physical, virtual and cognitive, but it's the hard wires under the sea, okay? Which, as I wrote about in the book, Revealing Secrets, my colleague, the first thing that got cut in 1939 and 1914, snip, 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 the cables. And of course, we're now more dependent on them than ever. The global information grid is 95% based on cables. And then, of course, we've got increased environmental challenges. We've got a whole swag of them with climate change, extreme weather events, food security challenges, and the prospect of sea level rise that are doing our heads in. And in Australia's context, generating all sorts of alarm. And we also don't think about Antarctica very much. 40% of it is claimed by Australia. China is making inroads. It's set up it's got 4 bases in there now. 3 of them are on Australian Antarctic territory. If that place melts by the time our grandkids are here, what are we going to do? Well, China's already thinking about it. We're not. We are sitting on our hands, watching the river flow. So we need to bolster capability to operate in and around that, and we need to be thinking of this in terms of competition, that unrestricted competition I was talking about. Now, from an Australian point of view, we've been used to the unipolar moment. You know, we're happy to plug and play with you guys in Iraq, Afghanistan, Korea, Vietnam, pretty well anywhere. And for the last few decades, since the end of the Cold War, it's been with a pretty unique, a bit of a boutique defence force. It's not been particularly big because it didn't need to be, right? You didn't need that much from us. We gave you what you wanted, and it was good both ways. We benefited from it. Now, though, what we're facing is a conundrum the likes of which we haven't seen in generations, which is that it could all happen at once. We might have a war. We could have all of these kind of issues. They've happened over time. But if they start happening concurrently, we are in a deep hole. And we're not ready. So, is Australia relevant? When you look at the Peters projection, it looks like we're just on the corner of not much relevance. If you adjust it, we're actually pretty central, I would contend. Right? So there's my bluff, my bottom line up front, which I teach my students in my course, Honeypots and Overcoats. The bluff is critical. Why are we here? What are we doing? And of course, the global challenges, they're the same ones you guys face, but they look different from here, which is why I'm encouraging Americans to come and study in Australia. Righto? Righto? You want to come in and study, you want your kids to come and study in Australia. Why? Because it's cheap, super cheap, 65 cents to the dollar. It's world-class education. It's exotic, but safe and roughly in English, as I say. Right? Okay, and you're going to have the time of your life. Right? It's a great place. No American has a bad time in Australia. Almost 100%, 99.75% guaranteed. Right? As Dr. Ziss would say. And we have a range of study. We've got the full spectrum, right? The whole full spectrum of scholarship, and we're the only place in the world with a college of Asia and the Pacific. That's my office just there. Yeah. And we do the spectrum of other things. We've got all sorts of other universities that do this as well. Excellent, world-class universities in Australia. And as I say, with an internship program, we've got high rankings, we've got great opportunities, and you're going to have a blast. So tell your kids, come to Australia. Roy, thank you.
One question, because you mentioned Taiwan, and that this was not going to be a Korea-like takeover. But I wonder if you could suggest what you think, what will happen in Taiwan, because the Chinese have their eyes set on having control of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Roy. And look, I don't know the future, and I think the strength of the West's deterrence will make a big difference. So if we were to do nothing, it would encourage a takeover by China, no question. So I think it's really important that we push back, that we show resolve. But at the same time, I think because of the worry about the jugular vein, the worry about the repeat of the fallout from Korea and similar circumstances, and of course the way that the war in Ukraine has not gone to plan, that they're very cautious about what they're going to do. So I think their preferred model is to squeeze and not seize. And squeeze to the point of defeating morale and undermining their resolve to resist Chinese overtures and demands. And that can happen, that can take time. And in the meantime, there's interference in domestic politics that can be undertaken, and more intimidation, muscling up further to the point where the bottom line is, if the United States resolve is broken, they win. And the muscling up of China is, in my view, mostly designed to scare you off, so you don't bother. So you just walk away, which is classic Sun Tzu, right? I think that's what they want. Yeah, thanks, Roy.
Follow up to Roy's question. One of your slides said that the Chinese Communist Party goal is to bring Taiwan into their realm of influence.
Yes.
Completely by 2032. So how do you resolve that with the Korean War influence on that decision-making process?
So 2032 is 8 years away.
Right.
That's 2 presidential election cycles. And there's a lot that can happen in 8 years. And what they are doing at the moment is building their nuclear stockpile and their offensive weapons capability gangbusters. Hypersonics, long-range ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, etc. Their amphibious force, all of these are being honed as we speak to get to the point where if Xi feels that he's got to do it before he falls off the perch, he has the ability to do it with the confidence that the fallout will be minimised. So by doing it swiftly and compellingly, particularly if he can convince the United States that it shouldn't. But I go back to my previous point, which is that that's not, I think, the game plan. The game plan is to squeeze, not seize, and that is because of the dire risk of being choked at Malacca and of generating a global visceral pushback as the one that generated the establishment of the UN command in Korea in 1950 under MacArthur.
The AUKUS Treaty is obviously a big part of the relationship, or
Yep.
big part of Australia's future plans for defense. But in the 3 years since it's been signed, there have been increasing industrial-based problems with both the UK and US submarine programs.
Yep.
How much is kind of the AUKUS plan is very complicated, and I'm just wondering how much the Australian defense community is thinking about what happens when one or two or one of these parts goes wrong due to industrial base concerns, and how can we, like, what's the plan if that happens, or how much thinking is going on about the likelihood of that happening and how things are likely to unfold?
Yep, that's a great question. Thank you. There's a lot of thought going into that at the moment, and we've just seen a passage of a deal here in the US and in Australia and in the UK that enables Australian industry, small to medium enterprises, to contribute to the nuclear submarine manufacturing pipeline. There is HII, the Huntington Ingalls Industries, the principal, other than Electric Boat, the two major nuclear submarine manufacturers, have significant vulnerabilities in that a large proportion of the componentry in the manufacturing pipeline has single points of failure. And the new arrangement offers the potential for several of those to be replicated to accelerate the production line and to provide redundancy and some acceleration. Mm-hmm. So there is prospects for that to happen. It hasn't happened yet. There's about 4 companies that I'm aware of that have been signed up to help HII and EB get the job done, but there's more to be done. So but it's really important, I think, to not lose our cool over this and to recognise that this is a long game, and that, as I say, China is playing the long game. There's people who are saying 2027. Admiral Davidson, the former commander of PACOM before it became Indo-PACOM, said it was going to be 2027 was the year of decision. 2027 is the year when estimates suggest the Chinese will have the military capability to do it. But that's a different matter to whether you have the political resolve to do it, right? And I don't think I think that's an important benchmark in terms of us aiming to accelerate our ability to respond, but it's not the gate doesn't get closed in 2027. It just becomes more vulnerable. Thanks.
So just to follow up a question on that, AUKUS is a industrial agreement on manufacturing of submarines. Why is it not a treaty in the form of actually an alliance? Was this all the traffic would bear at the time that was negotiated?
So it's a great question. I don't think it needs to be a treaty because there are aspects of this that are about getting laws put in place, and they've been passed by Congress end of last year, and this year subsequent regulations are being developed, and similarly in Australia and the UK. There's already an alliance. I mean, the UK is in alliance with the United States through NATO. Australia is in the alliance through ANZUS. And of course, as I put out and made that clear in that book, the Australia's-American Alliance, there is a plethora of other Lilliputian-like connections, sinews if you like, that connect Australia and the United States that don't require a fresh alliance per se. And I think there's rhetorically little to be gained as well from going there. That's in fact a bit of it would be, I think, a little bit of an own goal, in part because eventually what we're doing between these 3 countries is something that perhaps other countries can plug into. And Japan is knocking on the door to participate in particularly in Pillar 2 of the AUKUS arrangement. They don't need nuclear propulsion submarines like Australia does, but they want to play in the high-tech defence industry space, hypersonics, AI, quantum computing and so on. And I make a point about Japanese submarines. Japan got advanced air-independent propulsion submarines. Their submarines are very sophisticated and good enough for operating in and around the islands of Japan. You can't get to a single other port in Australia with that kind of capability. So the requirements are different. Yeah, thanks, Ray.
What is the benefit to Australia in focusing on defence and not just kind of saying forget defence and focusing on trade with China rather than taking a defence perspective? And then kind of going along with that, what % of Australia's GDP is being spent currently on defence, and what % of Australia's GDP is, or of the defense budget is going to AUKUS, which we talked about a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple of questions there. The first one on defence or trade. It's not an either or. You guys do more trade with China than we do, right? Proportionally, we do more, proportionally, but we're not at war with them, right? We're in competition, and they buy from us not because they like our liberal democracy, but because it's a good deal, right? And we like to sell to them because we get a good deal out of it. So in the meantime, we're wary about what they might do, and we're looking to deter them wanting to cross the kinetic threshold into open war. In the meantime, we can compete, and it can get a bit cutthroat, but we're competing. Like that prism I put up before, the competition prism, all of these things are happening concurrently. And we don't want to go to war with China. We don't want them to attack Taiwan. But we're looking to hedge our bets, to risk mitigate and do what we can. And that involves continuing to trade and continuing to bolster defence capabilities. Now, on the second question, on defence expenditure, we spend about 2% of GDP on defence in Australia. Obviously, that fluctuates a little bit based on the strength of the economy, and I think we're just a little bit over 2% of GDP at the moment. And we're on a trajectory to grow to about 2.5%, I understand. The thing is, in Australia, there's competing pressures on the budget, right? So what's happened is we have not spent a lot of extra money on AUKUS so far. We've taken it out of Hyde. So and that's because there's a real tension between, well, what do you do? Is it, guns or butter? Are you going to do things for the society? How many schools and hospitals don't get built because you're going to buy more F-35s or buy some more SSN nuclear propulsion submarines, right? These are ongoing debates in society. There are people who see the efficacy and the utility of spending money on defence, and there are others, naysayers, who'd say, no, that's terrible, waste of money, merchants of death and all that kind of stuff. So there's, like in the US and elsewhere in the world, in liberal democracies, there's a contestation of views. In the Australian context, there is a political split that is making it difficult for the current government to go further than they have now. And that's because in the Labor Party is, which is in current government, it's the centre-left party, it's kind of the Democrats of Australia, they have been supportive of AUKUS, but the left of the party is not really keen, right? And the left and the Greens, which are further left, are opposed, right? So to manage this, they've decided to keep going with the AUKUS program, but not spend too much more on it, right? So they've need just a little bit of incremental increase in expenditure, and so turn off a squadron of F-35s, turn off a couple of infantry battalions, save a little bit on a couple of armoured weapons programs to make AUKUS happen. That's what's happening, but we're getting to the point now where that's not going to work much more. In fact, it's becoming corrosive on the capabilities of the combined joint Australian Defence Force team. So that's kind of where we are. I hope that's answered the question.
Another question we have, there have been a number of incidents of ships, I think both Russian and from China, accidentally cutting underwater cables. The extent to which this is an accident, up for debate. How should Australia and the U.S. respond to this? Obviously you don't want to allow that to continue.
No.
But what's the best way to respond without escalating?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Well, certainly we can démarche, we can acknowledge, we can put this. It's really one of the great things you can do in this era of unrestricted competition is shed light on wrongdoing, right? And this is what Philippines have been pretty good at doing in the South China Sea. They've been exposing malevolent behaviour by China in the South China Sea by filming it and then broadcasting it. It's brilliant, actually. They've got egg all over their face, right? So that's one thing that can be done. The other thing is the use of more actively use of drone technology to monitor and to respond underwater along these lines. So that's, I think, one of the things that can be done, and there's some writing about that just recently, about the need to double down on drones to protect the cables. So there's more, I'm sure. Yeah, thank you.
The Chinese intelligence agencies and apparently even average policemen are active in the U.S., suppressing dissidents and chasing down people that Xi Jinping wants to persecute. I've read stories that that's also happening to an even greater extent in Australia. Are you confident that Australia has the means to prevent that?
I don't know if any of us have the means to completely prevent it, but our domestic security intelligence bodies, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, which I wrote a couple of the volumes of the history of, and our state and federal police agencies are actively involved in seeking to counter it at the moment. It's become, a few years ago, everybody was turning a blind eye because they didn't want to kind of acknowledge it. It just seemed, in terms of that unrestricted competition, we just didn't want to face what we were, the gravity of the challenge. There is much more awareness now. It's still an ongoing challenge because China is actually very clever at hiding its, hiding its tracks and not making it too obvious and making it difficult to call them out and imposing costs on calling it out. But it's happening more and more. The exact level of it, I know the ASIO annual report. Every year, ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, it's across kind of a FBI cross. It doesn't have the policing powers of FBI, but it's a domestic security intelligence agency. It puts out an annual report and it details all of the numbers of actions it's thwarted, and the Director General, a guy called Mike Burgess, is quite active in doing that, putting the spotlight on malevolent action. So, yeah, it's not perfect. There's a lot probably going under the radar, but like in the US, there's a concerted effort to counter it.
How will the Trump tariffs, if imposed, impact the U.S.-Australian relationship? And is that something that in Australia there's genuine concern over?
So great question. No, there's genuine concern. We like to think that we might be able to get a pass on the tariffs because we have the terms of trade are favourable to the United States at the moment. You have a trade surplus with us, right? And it's a considerable surplus with Australia. And we are a major source of foreign direct investment in Australia. We have a funds, the superannuation investment fund. It's a couple of $1 trillion. It's one of the biggest in the world, actually. It's been going for 40 years now, this compulsory superannuation scheme that's generated a very big pool of money, a lot of which is being invested in the United States. It's because it's considered a good bet, right? There's been efforts to try and redirect some of it to Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and the fund managers have said, no, we're doing this purely on what's the best return, which is the United States. Right? That's the idea. So, and conversely, there's massive the biggest foreign direct investor, as I say, in the United States, in Australia, is the United States by a country mile. I mean, it's head and shoulders above. So the economics of the relationship between Australia and the United States are unmatched by others. It's quite different to Japan, Korea, Europe, China. Our terms of trade are very much favouring the United States. So if that doesn't warrant an exemption, then something's amiss. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Well, something may be amiss anyway. As we know, logic is not necessarily what's driving the idea of sanctions and tariffs right now. So it seems to me that you've covered the waterfront, or the East Indian, what do you call it, the ocean front. Everything from Napoleon and Sun Tzu to your observation that Australia is a middle-sized power with small power pretensions. But it seems to me Australia is worth listening to, and its perspective is really valuable, and it really illuminates the whole of Asian region and the East Indian Ocean region superbly. And I thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Roy.
Thanks.